Lisa Machado, who will moderate our next session, Moving Clinical Trials Closer to Patients. Did it take a pandemic? Lisa Machado is the founder of the Canadian CML Network, an advocacy organization that supports people living with chronic myeloid leukemia. She is also a journalist and the executive producer of Postmedia's Healthing.ca, which I encourage you to check out. It is full of great stories and articles. Welcome, Lisa, and I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Elise. I'm so glad to be here. And thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to this session, Moving Clinical Trials Closer to Patients. Did it take a pandemic? Clinical trials are a lot of things. They can symbolize innovation and research. They answer critical questions about treatments and the impacts of disease. They mark the success and failure of science, but most importantly, they symbolize hope. And we've seen this up close through the pandemic as we've waited for a vaccine that will keep us safe, healthy, and allow life to begin again. For people living with health challenges, clinical trials represent the same things: safety, health, and normalcy. COVID-19 has forced us to reimagine the way we do so many things, from the way we shop to how we offer and consume healthcare. So many things have moved remote, including our bodies. And guess what? We've discovered that it mostly works. And clinical trials are no exception, as we've heard already today. Today, we're going to hear from 3 leaders in the clinical trial space on how the pandemic has forced us to reimagine the delivery of clinical trials, why they're necessary, what's worked and what hasn't, how to ensure the collaboration of all stakeholders, and most importantly, what does it all look like as we move forward? On our panel today, we have Katie Raposa, the Director of Research and Quality Integration at the University Health Network. She has more than 20 years of experience in the clinical trial research regulatory environment. George Mamari works in clinical trials operations with Novartis Pharmaceuticals Canada, Inc. He's involved in a number of working groups, including the Ontario Clinical Trials Working Group. And then we have Craig Lipsett, the founder of Clinical Innovation Partners, and also an adjunct assistant professor in health informatics at Rutgers, and an adjunct instructor in the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester. And there's a little button you can check to find out more detail on everyone's bios. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks for joining me today on the panel. We'll start a discussion with Katie. Good afternoon, Katie.
Hello. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Lisa. I think that you gave a pretty fair overview already of what we're going to be hearing about today, and how COVID has really impacted our clinical research practices and processes. So I'd like to thank CTO, first of all, for letting me have this opportunity to present and give you a picture of just what it was like for us. I'm going to focus mostly on the UHN experience, and that's from the site perspective. And I know many of you will have similar experiences from your own places of work and how you fit into the research community. But today I'm going to talk about, from a UHN perspective, looking at where we started, where we are now, and provide kind of a high-level overview of how we got here and hopefully what we've learned along the way. And then I hope to get you thinking about what may be coming next and provide you maybe with some food for thought along the way. Just a quick review. I know we all lived this, but just to put it all into context, it was just over a year ago in January of 2020 that we saw our first presumptive case in Ontario, and that quickly moved into a declared global pandemic and initiation of multiple public health measures here in Ontario and around the world to try and halt the spread of this virus. We fast forward to December 2020 throughout a backdrop of those ensuing months with varying case counts, horrific numbers of outbreaks and deaths, particularly in our vulnerable elderly population, extensive border and travel restrictions, almost daily changing public health guidance. And we reach December 14th, just when we think it's safe again. And we have the amazing advent of the first vaccines, and the first one given in Ontario is given in Toronto. And we think that we're on the mend and we're having some big wins here. Vaccine development at that pace was unheard of. And again, thanks to clinical research for making that happen. So then we get into, right after that, we think we're on a win and we're on a path forward here. And just after Christmas, we went into further lockdown and had renewed lockdown issues with the arrival of variants of concern. So as of March 17th of this year, almost exactly a year from when we started, we find that we've entered a concerning third wave has been declared, and the variants of concern that were starting to appear are now over 50% of our positive cases. Clearly, this COVID is not a linear path, and we have established from the outset that we must be flexible and ready to respond to anything. So we could be going forward, we could be going backward, or somewhere in between. Each institution I know will manage this according to their own internal and external context. So let's for a minute just go back to March of last year and see how it all started for us. On March 12th, we were actually notified by our research leadership that we were expected to initiate planning for reduction and possible complete shutdown of our on-site research activity. That was our basic research and our clinical research. And we were told to prepare to activate that planning within a 48-hour notice. And a mere 4 days later, the trigger was pulled and we were told to suspend all of our non-essential clinical research activity. So that meant no new projects, halting of recruitment, and moving remotely anything that could be moved to remote visits, keeping on-site things only for those things that truly needed to be done on-site. As you're well aware, I'm sure, our typical model of clinical research in Ontario is hospital-based. And we have all of our essential stakeholders that are either functioning at the hospital or certainly centered around the site approach. And we bring the participants to us. COVID changed all that. And we now see that the participant is in the community. And our challenge now is to how do we maintain those essential priorities of safety, privacy, study continuity, when we have to go now out to where the participant is, and there's this COVID environment in the background. We still have the ethical obligations for continuity of care clinically, for continued participation, and to complete the research for which the participants have agreed to participate. And we still have to maintain our data integrity. And as John Marshall mentioned, contracts and funder agreements are still lurking in the background, and that's still a big part of what we have to do. We have to look at those relationships with our external partners as well. The suspend order was really a rapid response situation where we went from notification to suspension in less than a week. So how the question became, how do you do that safely and ensure consistency in the principles and the principle-based standards are applied? First, we needed to define a decision-making structure, and this certainly varies from institution to institution. Our experience at UHN is that our research is fairly decentralized and is program-based, and that works for a lot of reasons. But trying to establish now a centralized model of decision-making and setting standards became yet another thing that we had to work through. So we immediately established an ad hoc working group and reporting through our research emergency management structure at the time. We gathered our subject matter experts and we decided, we sought out what needs to be done, how can we make it work, and what challenges and risks need to be addressed. The goal was certainly not perfection, but ultimately and promptly defining what were acceptable solutions at the time. The response for on-site and remote activities was for on-site and remote activities. We needed to look first at the on-site things, and we had to define first, what does essential mean? And so that we defined as those activities that supported clinical continuity of care, participant safety assessments, and study endpoints, because again, we have those ethical obligations to continue that research in which the patients are participating. And we also had the new added element of COVID studies. And all of this was done in the COVID environment. The PIs led the assessments, and because they're best positioned to determine based on the study, the patient population, and a case-by-case consideration which visits could be done on site, which ones could be moved remotely, and which things could actually maybe be put on hold for a bit. We still had challenges, though, even within those decision-making processes. There was still that underlying COVID experience, and people were a little, they were anxious about coming into hospitals. This was for the staff and the participants. And there was concerns about things like using public transit and uncertainty with changing public health recommendations and never really knowing what the guidance was going to be the next day. So that did pose some problems with bringing people on site, even for those visits that were allowed. COVID studies added a whole other layer of consideration. And these new studies were time sensitive, to prepare, to launch, and to approve. The RAB prioritized them, and there were so many so quickly at one point that we actually had more studies than we had inpatients, and most of our patients at the time, our COVID patients, were inpatients. And so we had developed some concerns then about overwhelming our patients and our inpatient units as well, and how are we going to integrate that those new studies into how we're going to manage. So this established a whole new additional way of thinking, and it launched a new approach of collaboration between PIs and clinical areas. We initiated a pre-screening committee to look at studies that were up and coming and look at them for feasibility, and encouraging merging of studies, sharing of samples, things that are generally not all that common in the clinical research environment in a large center. We implemented a centralized COVID recruitment coordinator, limiting access to the COVID patients for recruitment so that they weren't overwhelmed with multiple studies to choose from. John Marshall mentioned the change in consent process, because now you have a patient who's, even when they're in the hospital, they're still isolated, and how do you manage that? So we came up with some very creative solutions around using walkie-talkies and signing 2 separate consent forms, so the one in the patient's room never actually left the room. Lots of creativity that came about, and I think that was one of the biggest benefits that we had. Eventually, we did have ambulatory visits for our patients, for our COVID patients, and that was, again, another challenge that we had to work through, as now we have to see COVID positive patients and yet protect our staff and protect other patients. So we had to develop a new outpatient process and location for those as well. So lots of things happening all at once, and lots of creative solutions going on. That was just for the inpatient things. So now for the remote visits, they were no less challenging and no less creative with the solutions. Accessibility to technology was certainly a key consideration, and we saw expanding use of phone visits, virtual visits, and we tried to align those activities as much as possible with the clinical efforts within the hospital as well. We even went back to started to use MS Teams, and I know Brianne talked about using MS Teams for team visits. We also used them for study visits as well, and exploring further opportunities for changing consent models, using email, initiating direct to participant drug shipments, that some of those things that Brianne mentioned as well. And these are all in the learning stage, and we certainly don't have a handle on them, but we're trying to make things work and make the best creative solutions that we can. At the same time, the staff were working remotely, so we had to work on how we're going to manage electronic documents and paper. Of course, we still have paper. So all this was required very close collaboration internally, and you keep hearing that collaboration word come up, I'm sure. Working closely with the RAB, with privacy, with our IT departments, with pharmacy, and everyone to ensure the safety and continuity of the research. And finally, on the remote front, we also recognize the importance of study monitoring, and sponsor activity was similarly restricted. We had and still have a no visitor policy at our hospital, so that applied to all external personnel. So I know there's variability between sites and teams and sponsors of how studies are managed. Some are more electronic, some are more paper-based. We did work through establishing some guidance, some instructions, SOPs, communications, to really try and standardize our approach internally and increase the opportunity to liaise with the sponsors and see how they were working through some of their changes, because they were all working on the same issues from different perspectives. Our initial efforts for study monitoring remotely involved guided monitoring visits, where the study coordinator was actually screen sharing and driving the clicking, and that was I think difficult for everybody. And then we eventually moved into MS Teams meetings using screen sharing. We had then actual control given to the study monitors. So there was much variation again internally. We've got over 400 different funders and sponsors just at UHN, and I know that that's variable across the world. We have global partners in our sponsors as well. So we had to really work with our sponsors and have more of a communication and collaboration with how we're going to make these things work. From a volume perspective at UHN, just to give you a snapshot picture here, average new studies that were authorized on an annual basis, clinical trials was around 300 a year up until 2019. And we did see a drop in 2020, but perhaps not as much as we might have expected. Some of these 2020 studies were also including these COVID studies. So we had an influx of these COVID trials that we talked about. These are the ones that are currently approved. And we've had over 260 studies submitted to date, and they're in various stages of review and approval. Certainly in the early days, there was the influx of amendments and an influx of protocol changes, and the new COVID studies, the RAB was, as you can imagine, working around the clock. So while there wasn't a dramatic drop in studies, new studies per se, we did see a drop in accrual. And I think one of the most telling line graphs that I've seen in a while is the snapshot from Princess Margaret Cancer Centre, and it demonstrates a marked drop in accrual of clinical trials. That's the yellow line. Over the course of the pandemic. So from January, you can see where it starts off, and you can see the dip as we get into March, and that continued through to June. The green line is the non-clinical trials prospective studies, and that was even more of a precipitous drop at the beginning of the pandemic. And you can see that year over year, those numbers have decreased quite significantly in their participant accrual. So just after the 3 months, then when we got through our suspend phase, then we were figuring, okay, it's time now. We can start to plan and to refocus and prepare for our restart phase. So we really needed to have something more structured, and began preparations for a very cautious restart. We developed a phasing in of the on-site activity, and we developed 3 phases. Phase 1. 25 to 50%, phase 2 up to 75, and phase 3 would be up to 100. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. The suspension activity was focused on a rapid response and ramping down of activity. The restart planning now is moving into how it has to be required to be more restructured and more structured approach to the safety and the restart activity on site. So we took the time then to assess where we were, what was working, what wasn't, and the goal was to take advantage of those opportunities and further stretch and improve some of those creative solutions. The challenge again was alignment internally and externally. There's lots of things internally with our clinical activity people, with our occupational health, with IPAC guidance, and externally with our Toronto Public Health, with the university sponsors. There's lots of moving parts here that we had to consider, but we really wanted to leverage the experience that we had. So we pulled together another panel of experts. We developed a clinical research restart committee engaged our PIs, experienced PIs, research coordinators, patient partners, and some operations leaders to make sure that we could get everything actually moving. And they provided structured response planning, decision-making, developed standards, guidance, and tools along the way. And in the spirit of collaboration, I just want to say that we also had the opportunity to join other like-minded professionals in the CTO working groups that were kind of referenced earlier today as well. And you're going to be hearing more about those as well. We had the opportunity to share some of this work with them. So I hope I'm not stealing anybody's thunder, but the toolkit has actually gone live. So I think there's going to be a link provided, and we can see some of these tools and see if hopefully they'll be of some use to you. They were certainly developed for our use internally, but along with other sites and other institutions, we did provide some of these things through CTO, and hopefully they'll be of some help to people. So we did look at, when we restarted, some structure around how are we going to restart safely. And the first step was to establish a common standard and process, and this has to be principles-based. So we had to make sure that we had the coordinated resumption of activities, still maintaining those principles of safety, and making sure that we can get everything done to maintain our data integrity and our safety parameters for our patients. We couldn't start everything all at once, so we had to have our PIs look at what could and couldn't be done. We looked at our mandatory go, no-go kind of questions, like can we maintain our public health guidance? Can we meet the protocol requirements? That's a really big consideration if you're going to restart a study. So for example, at the time, pulmonary function tests were suspended. So if your protocol required that, it would probably not be a good time to restart it. So once again, the coordination and alignment internally with clinical service was required because our clinical services were still feeling the pressure of the COVID response and the inpatient activity. So we had to make sure that we weren't overburdening those services. So we asked our PIs, because again, they're best positioned to know the studies, to prioritize based on specific criteria regarding risk and benefits to the study population and the burden of the clinical research, clinical services activities. We asked them to prioritize when they were going to plan to restart the activities in phase 1, 2, or 3. Overall, we had almost 300 PIs, 287, I think, PIs submitted 670 different studies, all spread out during those different phases. The majority of those were in phase 1 and 2. And all of this, again, is available on the toolkit. So hopefully it will provide some kind of a framework that you can look at and see if that's of any help to you. Now that we're settled into what could be considered, I guess, some kind of a new normal, a current state, I guess, we still recognize that the situation is fluid and is going to change at any time. We developed contingency plans also to help guide our future considerations. So what happens to your study team if you get quarantined, and how do you ensure then coverage across different studies, and what happens if your staff can't come in and can't complete those study activities. Also, we had to monitor our own study activity on site and be prepared to ramp down again on short notice if that was required. So we're still looking for more creative opportunities, building on what we've done with creative consent and using email and telephones. I see Brianne also mentioned the use of REDCap. We're actually just about to launch a trial of REDCap for virtual consent. These are all very exciting things that we can look to build upon. All of our study monitoring is currently being done remotely, and that's been very successful. We have improved EPR access with direct access for our study sponsors, so that there's no worry about screen sharing with the coordinators and such. They do use MS Teams to upload paper scanned documents. That's still somewhat of a burden, but that's something that we can continue to work on. We're looking at our current state here. Let me see what we're continuing to look for where we are. So where we are right now is that most of our study visits are happening remotely, and remotely seems to be working. In fact, we're looking at this data that was provided to me by our electronic patient record and our virtual care team. The yellow bar actually shows volumes of clinical care and shows the face-to-face visits. And you can see from February where it predominantly was face-to-face visits, and you can see the blue bars that have grown since then over the last year. And this clearly demonstrates a marked increase in our virtual care activities. Now, again, these are clinical care visits. Clinical care visits have gone from 250 virtual visits a week in February to over 8,000 currently. So that's a giant increase. And right now, 35% of our UHN clinical visits are done virtually. So these are clinical visits again, but a lot of our research visits are done in line with our clinical visits. So it's I think a fairly decent proxy. From a specifically research perspective, we did ask our PIs to tell us how many of your studies are doing virtual visits and how many of you are doing on-site visits. And this snapshot really shows that we're sitting at about 50%. There's some variation based on the type of research. Our Kite Research Institute is out of Toronto Rehab, and they do a lot of in-person visits with their technology and their engineering kind of research. And the Joint Department of Medical Imaging also is reliant on their on-site visits for their imaging. So that's just a little bit of a difference in how those studies may portray. But overall, we're looking at about 50% of our studies only are doing in-person visits. And while we're able right now to have up to 75% of our on-site activity, we're actually found that we're sitting between 25 and 50%, as this snapshot kind of shows. So what's going on here? Is it a COVID phenomenon still? Or are remote visits so successful that this is just going to be the way it is from now on? We actually have more questions than answers. But we have learned a few things. Virtual visits appear to work. UHN has initiated actually a new program. It's just launched, dedicated completely to virtual care. And this includes an entire committee of dedicated patient partners. We've also learned that the same principles still apply across our research and around safety and data integrity. But what's really seems to have changed is that we've been a lot more creative with our solutions, and we've been able to stretch our thinking quite a bit. We've learned that technology can support or threaten by its presence or absence. There's always issues of equity of technology access for sure, but we do have to worry about and can be concerned about the confidence in its use and trust and still maintaining to build those relationships. But key to all of this is communication and collaboration, internally and externally. You're going to hear that theme, I think, over and over again. So some things for you to think about as we go forward. Have we moved things closer to the participant? I don't even know. What does that actually even mean? Does closer mean remote visits, or does that mean that the participants should have more of a decision-making role up front and more of a design role? Certainly more of a voice and a choice, and that's been clear to us in our interactions with the participants to date. Is this our new normal? What is that going to look like? Are remote visits the first step towards truly decentralized trials? And we don't have, like I say, we don't have the answers, but we can start posing the questions. And I think that's the main point, is that's what research is really all about, is asking what if and what comes next. So we all know COVID was disruptive. And however this is presented to us, we can see that we have now many opportunities. And I think we've sparked an innovative spirit in collaboration that wasn't perhaps as strong before as it is now. So COVID, I would say, has created that burning platform, but not just created it, but it's also given us a good shove. And our challenge now is going to be to grab onto that and to really take advantage going forward. One thing is clear, we can't do this alone. We have to collaborate across all of the research community. So that's sites, sponsors, regulators, participants, everybody. So to help us exploring what is going to be next and to challenge our thinking, I hope, on the future direction of our clinical trials, I'm going to pass over to George Mamari, who's the clinical trial operations manager at Novartis. But before I do that, I just would like to take a minute to share some really important acknowledgements. Our clinical research working group and our clinical research restart committee have done an incredible amount of work. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention them in all the work that they've done. They were tireless. They responded to the call, and they just drove this right along through the entire process. We've had the opportunity to share this, so some of the work is available on the CTO website. I would like to extend a special thanks to Chris, Christine, and Mike for putting it all together and making sure that it actually got up and running, because that was a very huge job. So now I'm going to pass to George, who's going to give us some further food for thought and challenge your thinking on what's next. George.
Thank you, Katie, for that excellent presentation. COVID-19 changed our lives in ways we never imagined. As an industry, we scrambled to find solutions, often temporary, for our patients, looking out for their safety and continued supply of investigational medicinal products. And obviously, we wanted to make sure that there's a continuity for our clinical trials. So much was at stake. What was thought to be a temporary situation turned into a semi-permanent reality with a redefined context and purpose. In some ways, challenges turned into opportunities for more adaptable, agile, and participant-centric models. Those same temporary situations and solutions forced us into streamlining our processes and to reduce the unnecessary steps. As all efforts were focused on participants, the pandemic catalyzed an appetite for alignment and sharing best practices, and to seize the opportunity to raise above. The reset button was pushed, giving the world a window of opportunity to reimagine clinical research. Coordinated by Clinical Trials Ontario and chaired by Pat Clifford, the Reimagine Clinical Trials Working Group brought together subject matter experts from industry, institutions, and ethics, with further consultation from the College of Lived Experiences for participant and caregiver perspective, and privacy and IT subcommittees. We started meeting in October of last year and continue on our mandate to look at various topics that are required to modernize clinical research in Canada and enhance participants' experience in future clinical trial models. I want to take a moment to highlight the exceptional work done by Pat, keeping us aligned and focused while capturing the essence of various point of views for a coordinated, structured, and result-driven outcome. I also want to thank our experts for their engagement, transparent, and valuable inputs, thoughts, and ideas for collective success. So why was it important for us to come together? because the world has changed. We all have changed. Clinical trials have changed. And we cannot lose momentum, as it is our social responsibility as a research community and to our participants and their caregivers. It is time for us to rethink our approach to clinical trials, and we cannot afford not to embrace the change. We must break free from the status quo as we're competing on a global stage. And of course, we need to give more choice and opportunities to participants and their caregivers. So let's look at a typical model of operation at an investigational site. How can we build an enhanced participant and caregiver experience and give them more choice in a centralized structure? It may be possible to a certain extent, but not optimal, and certainly limited to participants' proximity to the investigational site. Now, what if we operationalize clinical trials around the participants and their caregivers? What if the research site became a network of multiple players bringing clinical trials to participants and their caregivers? What if everyone took an active role and responsibility for conducting clinical research? What if clinical trials became a clear option, regardless of where participants live and how close they are to a research center? I think the answer is not if, but when, and how ready is Canada? Will we pioneer or be an early adopter? Will we shape the policies and practices, or will we join in a movement that is redefining clinical research? Will it be centralized? Will it be hybrid, or fully decentralized? So let's talk about decentralized clinical trials, or some may refer to it as patient-centric remote trials, which I think says a lot. While we recognize that a decentralized model may take many forms and it may not be suitable for every trial or every indication, it is being implemented in new protocols as a hybrid model or offsite visits, and will certainly be the future of clinical research. Decentralized clinical trials have two main attributes. One, a decreased reliance on an intermediary, and two, a decreased reliance on a physical location. And what are the potential benefits of a decentralized model? They're countless. It reduces burden on participants, sites, and potentially the healthcare system. It improves patient retention. It gives more control to participants and their caregivers. It allows for faster recruitment timelines, faster overall study timelines that could potentially translate into quicker access to new treatments. It increases diversity of participants in clinical trials, and it provides a greater access to research. And of course, it doesn't mean that there are no challenges, but these challenges are opportunities for redefining our operations, logistics, regulations, ethical, privacy considerations, as we've done to a certain extent during the pandemic. And we could make research in Canada look like a network mapped and engaged by the clinical trial community to serve one and only one thing: participants and their caregivers. Where access to research is no longer defined by where participants live, where we all embrace and share the responsibility and the accountability, while participants take a more active role in their treatment options, where clinical trials are open to recruitment from coast to coast. Maybe a blue sky thinking, but is it really? It could be the natural and strategic path for Canada. We were built for this. While we turn our vast geography into a huge opportunity where research is conducted in a diversified population, no longer limited nor institutionalized, our world-class expertise and infrastructure becomes the place to conduct research. And now let's hear it from the participants and their caregivers. Obviously, they want to have more choice and they want more agency in their own care options. They want better communication and flexibility, and they want to be involved in designing protocols. And this is not a one-size-fits-all, and we need to exercise agility and flexibility for all of us. I mean, not just the sponsors or the institutions or investigators, but we need ethics committees and regulators as we collectively embrace science and technological advancement for a socially responsible implementation. This is what participants want, and we need to enable it for them. So how do we open Canada to decentralized clinical trials or patient-centric remote trials? There are three elements: operations, and that was really what we focused on as a working group. We looked at remote consent, electronic consent, risk-based remote dynamic monitoring, direct-to-participant investigational product. We looked at home visits or remote labs, electronic recruitment tools, principal investigator oversights, digital strategies, and protocol designs. We looked at different strategies and synergies for alignment and putting in place recommendations, and our work is in progress, but we need help. We need help to adopt the regulations. We need help to change the mindset. This is a cross-stakeholder engagement and collaboration. And if we want to deliver on this promise, we need regulators and healthcare professionals and everyone involved in the clinical trials community to support us and the participants in this journey. By removing obstacles and boundaries so we can embrace a mindset of shared responsibility and accountability in the way we conduct research. We need your help so we can be ready for decentralized clinical trials. And now you'll hear it from Craig and look at what decentralized clinical trials could look like in the future. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone. What a great series of conversations so far. Well, as was mentioned, my name is Craig Lipset. I have a few different roles. I was previously the head of clinical innovation at Pfizer, which is where I had the opportunity about 12 or 13 years ago to help design the first fully remote, fully decentralized clinical trial run under an FDA IND. That actually fit into what is now a 17-year history of decentralized clinical trials. I have a nice graphic on that. It gets too small to share in a webinar like this. So if you follow me on Twitter, or if you're following the CTO 2021 hashtag, I'll put it up there in just a few minutes and you can take a look at it there. What I'd like to share, though, takes us forward beyond beyond the past 17 years of work that's already been going on in decentralized, and thinking beyond the important adoption that's been catalyzed over the last year by the pandemic and the sense of urgency to change because of the risk in our environment. What I'd like you to think about is, what does the world look like beyond the pandemic, even outside of clinical research? Because if you're like me, lots of things have been changing clearly in our worlds. Last year, around this time, during the peak of that first wave of lockdowns, we had to aggressively shift how we did our grocery shopping, how our kids were going to school, how we were taking business meetings, how we were obtaining care. We had to shift aggressively, all of us, to this digital and virtual space. But that doesn't mean that's where we all want to stay. I think for many of us, we welcome the idea of being able to swing the pendulum back, but not all the way back to where we were. We've been exposed to these new attributes that we want to incorporate in our daily lives. I have this screenshot here of a Panera food ordering app, because when I take my kids to Panera, or they want Panera for dinner and we order it from their app, the last step of the app, that last mile, gives me choice. And how do I want to engage? Do I want delivery to my house? Do I want to pick up the food at curbside outside the restaurant? Do we want to dine inside and select which table we're at? And I think it's that element of choice that I want to emphasize with you here today. When we look at data from Bain in the United States last year, online grocery shopping swung from 3 to 4% prior to the pandemic to upwards of 15% during the pandemic. And here as well, they're saying that crisis recedes, we land somewhere in between. Now, as sponsors and CROs were surveyed last year, most indicated that they were taking a hybrid approach. They were taking some virtual trial elements. In fact, when surveyed, 3/4 indicated that would be their mix. But I think we have to rethink what we mean when we're describing some or hybrid. Because early on in the world of decentralized trials, many started to talk about there being brick and mortar conventional sites, there being this notion of a fully remote, fully decentralized trial, and implied that hybrid was almost a compromised in between state. And we have to rethink what that really looks like, because in the world of many patients, when we talk to them about what they're looking for, when we're engaging patients for insight, more and more, as George just mentioned, what we hear is they want choice. And so we have to shift our minds from thinking about our schedule of events and thinking that our protocol should be defining visit 1 in the clinic, visit 2 at home, visit 3 in the clinic, and so on. Because as individuals, as consumers, if our grocery store followed that same paradigm and told us that January and March you'll come to the supermarket and February and April you will have home delivery, we would say that's not particularly customer centric. And likewise, we can't really look at this table of events where we're dictating to the patient how they're engaging and participating as being particularly customer centric either. And it's for that reason that our next generation of hybrid trials needs to be incorporating choice, where we can adapt based on patient preference and where they are in their journey. If you're younger than me and you have Netflix, maybe you refer to that as Bandersnatch meets clinical trials. If you're my age or older, maybe that's a choose your own adventure book. And that seems daunting for our trials today. It seems unrealistic. We'll quickly start to wonder, how can we have confidence in what we're measuring if people are measuring it in the clinic or at home? But remember, there's an entire wave of digital measurements and digital endpoint initiatives, validating new approaches to measure with greater confidence using digital tools, modernizing our endpoints so that they're not so fragile, so frail, such that if we measure it in one setting or another, we're introducing waves of variability that make the measurement futile. But in fact, these new digital measurements that are more location agnostic, sensors and wearables that don't care where the patient may be when the data is captured. Now, just as we're thinking about this type of flexibility for our participants, we also need to start thinking about this flexibility for our investigator sites themselves. Last year, Frost & Sullivan tracked a 64% year-over-year increase in the use of telehealth. And our investigator sites also responded similarly. In fact, when surveyed last summer by WCG, sites went from 28% utilization of telehealth. During the pandemic, it went up to 64%. And when asked about after the pandemic, 73% of sites indicating they plan to continue to use telehealth in their site after the pandemic. But when sponsors and CROs are running multi-center trials, we pass down study-specific, study-chosen technology. And we're not allowing sites to use technology that they've already invested in, that they've already embedded into their workflow, that they're already trained on. And what happens when we introduce unfamiliar technology into our studies? That's when we have errors. That's when we have training issues. And quite honestly, we have redundant costs. It's kind of like a freezer. If our sites need to have a freezer in order to support our trial, we can't all drop off our favorite freezer on their doorstep. We need to first look and see what kind of freezer they have and if it meets the standards and requirements for that study. If it does, Godspeed. And only if it doesn't should we focus on provisioning. When we think about things like electronic informed consent or use of video, we as sponsors and CROs need to start to shift our focus less on provisioning everything and creating chaos for our sites, and rethink around minimum quality standards and the interoperability where it matters. And so as we think about our go-forward model, most sponsors are taking a toolkit-driven approach. Again, there's not one archetype of decentralized trial that fits every study, but there's a consistent set of tools that we compare and deploy based on study-specific needs. How is the drug administered? What countries are we running in? What is the feedback from patients or regulators? And then pairing those insights with our tools, whether it's digital, like electronic consent, video visits, remote monitoring, whether it's new staffing models like visiting nurses in home health or a centralized investigator site, whether it's other data models like using local labs or local imaging centers, or whether it's how we extend our supply chain to make sure investigational product reaches patients where they are. Now, importantly, just a CTO is operating in this environment and looking at decentralized and how they can help support their stakeholders. There are quite a few other initiatives that are doing the same, and it's important to make those connections to build upward from the work that others are doing and to start at that common foundation with any of our initiatives, whether that's CTTI or IMI or the work of Transcelerate, SCRS, ACRO, and so on. The last one that I'll call out here, I happen to be the co-chair for DTRA. It's a relatively new nonprofit collaboration, now with 99 member organizations from the FDA to pharma manufacturers in the US, Europe, and Japan, CROs, tech companies, as well as others in healthcare like CVS, United Health, and others. Working together, this group is trying to help create a better playing field for scale and adoption of decentralized research. And you can follow DTRA in that top right corner on LinkedIn, Twitter, or on the web. And then finally, as I mentioned, if you follow my little handle there on Twitter or just check out the hashtag for CTO 2021, I'm going to drop there that 17-year history for decentralized trials. And with that, I'm looking forward to some of the conversation with the other panelists and with you.
Great. Thanks very much, Craig. Wow. Well, those were some really, really exciting conversations about clinical trials and where we're going and what we're doing right now. I have to say, as a patient advocate, my favorite terms were things like positioning the patient as a consumer. Love it. Patient and caregivers in the middle of that giant circle of healthcare providers. Excellent. So I wanted to, we're going to open it up to the group here. Hi, Brianne. Brianne has joined us. And let's talk about what it's going to take to fully embrace DCTs in Canada. Like, let's talk about, we've heard a lot about successes and failures and some of the challenges that each of you have identified and overcome. But let's have a group discussion and explore that a little bit more. Some of the themes that we've heard about, collaboration and getting all stakeholders on board. We also heard about creativity and using technology. So Katie referred to using walkie-talkies. So let's start there. Open the floor to Katie. What's it going to take?
What's it going to take?
I mean, surely if we can do all of this under a pandemic, it's...
Exactly. And that's, that's one of the key things that I keep going back to. This was not the ideal circumstances. So if we can do what we've done in the last year, in the farthest from ideal circumstances, boy, what could we do in the next 5? How could we make that look? We've had such great opportunities to launch some of this most creative thinking that I've seen in a long time. And yet the principles are the same. So those things haven't changed. And yet we've been able to rise above that and say, why not? Instead of, why can't we do it? We've been saying, why couldn't we do it? Maybe how can we move it forward, and looking for really more creative solutions. So different kinds of consent opportunities, and really truly engaging the participants and all the other stakeholders too, in a consistent collaborative approach across clinical care, clinical research. I loved that John Marshall talked about integrating clinical research right into clinical care. I'm a big fan of that also. But looking at how do we make this more opportunity and choice, and I loved Craig's approach about providing choice, because everything is not going to work Everything is not going to work the same for every instance, for every person, for every study. So what is it going to take? It's going to take creative thinking. And hey, we're researchers. That's what we do, right? We should be able to find those solutions and think about what it's going to take to move us forward is creative thinking around within the same parameters. It's guardrails, not hurdles. We should be thinking about creativity.
And kind of to piggyback off of that too, I think it's sharing that creativity, provincially and nationally, and being able to learn from one another, because I think sometimes we get stuck in our silos and what we've always done. And, once people hear what the possibilities are and sharing that and how well it works and kind of advocating for these changes, that's really how we can impact change and long-term change too.
I think we have to make sure first off that we don't judge our opinion of decentralized success or failure based on the urgent implementation during a pandemic. I know that online education can be delivered a heck of a lot better than it was for my kids when the schools had to quickly introduce this into their operating models. And the same is true for how we can implement decentralized in our research programs with forethought and planning as compared to the urgency that was required last year. When I think about implementing in a meaningful way in Canada, it's not a question of technology. The technology is available for us. It's a question of the regulatory receptivity. And so how do we help to position Canada as being friendly and receptive with clarity for research sponsors around regulatory expectations? But perhaps most importantly, it's culture. And if we can show that we have a receptive environment in terms of the culture for the research community, investigators, and others, that tends to be our rate limiter. I do think there'll be a tipping point, Lisa, as we start to build more confidence in these tools and we know that we can implement them, as researchers continue to listen to patients for input and insights into planning their studies, and they continue to speak out about the need for improved access and convenience, there will become an ethical imperative to include these tools when we're implementing. How else can we listen to patients telling us about the burden and challenge of participation, know that there are tools that are available, and fail to actually introduce them to meet their needs?
Yeah, absolutely. And George, you spoke a lot about collaboration. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, and how do we get buy-in? There are so many players in this space. How do we get buy-in?
You know what? It's always the question of mindset. And we talked about it during the pandemic. The focus became right on the participants because we were all again thinking about how do we continue with that treatment? How do we continue collecting the data? And how do we ensure their safety? And that mindset of getting really to what is really important made us take a couple of steps back and reduce on the extra steps and make it more easy. And now it's just embracing what we have already started. This is in motion right now. It's going forward. And it's just a question of us saying, you know what, this is an option. It could work. It did work during the pandemic, and it could work in a completely decentralized and more adaptive and more agile models of clinical trials. And just embracing it, all of us. I mean, again, it's not just the researchers, it's the sponsors, it's the institutions, ethics committees, Health Canada. We're again competing globally, and we need to really be on a mindset of forward thinking of what is expected to come in the next couple of months, and it's coming fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've talked about patients. I mean, obviously, we have skin in the game, to make sure that clinical trials are accessible and they easy to get to and that they work in our favor. But what about physicians? We haven't mentioned them. How does the circle of care mindset change around involving physicians in the clinical trials? Okay.
So, it's interesting. There's two roles for physicians, and when it comes to clinical research, right? We have physicians that are providing care for patients, and they're not always the same person as the person who's an investigator for the clinical trial. In fact, we know in truth it takes serendipity. That patient happens to be a patient of a doctor who happens to be an investigator in the study that happens to be right for you, which is crazy. But what's interesting about Decentralized, and this was uncovered for me by Pfizer's head of commercial development when we first did the remote trial, they pointed out that there's a new role for treating physicians that we can start to unlock when we're able to rethink the sub-investigator threshold. And by that, what I mean is their investigator roles and responsibilities, and let's say we can centralize them and enable them from a distant investigator. How can we enable the patient's own treating physician to now play a role, have the patient come there for some of the remote visits, all the responsibilities being taken by the investigator? Can the patient now go to their treating physician's office that's known and familiar for remote visits, maybe for blood draws or other engagements? We don't have a role like that for treating physicians today. Our ask of treating physicians today is either become an investigator, which is very disruptive to their practice, or refer your patients away, which is very disruptive to their ego and their clinic. And so I'm very excited to see, as these decentralized archetypes evolve, how we're able to do just this and start to find new ways to engage with treating physicians as participants themselves in research without necessarily disrupting their practice.
Right. Katie, did you see this as well?
The physicians' roles?
Getting involved.
Yeah, I think it's really important because, like Craig says, the referrals come from the treating physicians, but then they're often not in the loop anymore. So I think that, looking at what the role of the PI is compared to the role of the treating physician, when you've got a PI now and the patient's discharged, for example, or sent to another hospital, what is the continued role there, and how do we engage the entire care team to provide that ongoing continuity? And that's going to be a bit of a shift, I think, in roles and really looking at how we can best optimize what's best for the patient and what's best for the study. And maybe there needs to be more of a shared responsibility. There's going to have to be role clarity and changes. It's going to be with the regulators as well. And you look at how what an attending role looks like in another hospital versus maybe the patients in the community. And I think we really need to be clear about what those opportunities might look like to really engage larger members of the research team, and maybe not just the PIs, physician PIs. There's nurse practitioners, and there's quite a wide breadth of care providers in our current care teams. And I think we need to expand our thinking again. It's being more creative in how we think about these things.
Right. And I guess I want to throw it out to Brianne, because we heard a lot about your experiences. I mean, how did you incorporate physicians into your systems, and was there pushback? Like, what were their barriers?
Yeah, I think I have two thoughts around this. So one, as it relates to the virtual clinical trial that I described, there was lots of patients that were hesitant to enroll in this trial without their family physician knowing what was happening. They felt most comfortable with their family physician. So there was an opportunity for us to connect with the family physicians and keep them in the loop. And then it gave that patient that comfort that the person that knows them the best was involved in the potential treatment that they were going to be on. And there was still a little bit of reluctance and hesitancy on responsibilities that the attending physician would take on if they had advised their patient to enroll in the trial. So it was kind of getting the investigators and the attending physicians to speak together, which was a little bit of a challenge during the pandemic when lots of physicians' offices were closed, and these were family doctors. So that was a different experience. But another example in Alberta right now is I'm also part of managing we have a centralized COVID recruitment intake in the hospital. And so we have about 10 studies that we present to all of the COVID positive patients. And there's 10 different investigators in each of these trials, but the attending physicians are the ones that are really responsible for connecting us with those patients and getting that verbal consent to contact. And this was a wonderful opportunity. It took time to get the attendings kind of involved and on board, because initially their thoughts were, I don't have time for this. I don't have time to enroll these patients into these trials. I'm trying to treat them and care for them. But as soon as they realized that we were there to help them, and that the study investigators were there to provide potential treatment options, and that they wouldn't have that responsibility that come along with the clinical trial. But again, it was more about reassuring the patient, and the patient is working really closely with their attending. So getting on board and working closely together. I know that our attendings within the hospital right now, they have a totally different idea of clinical trials, and I'm hoping that that kind of expands post-pandemic to research and the possibilities that are out there, and the support that there is, when you have an experienced study team working with you.
Yeah, no, those are really great points. I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit, and we've already mentioned regulatory frameworks and environments. Can I get your thoughts on Health Canada's view of decentralized trials? Can anyone feedback on that?
I think that Health Canada is in a position right now that they are listening to the stakeholders. So they've had lots of stakeholder engagement to say, what are the issues right now with the current way that clinical trials are functioned and governed, and how can we make it easier? And I think that they're really working towards a risk-based approach to reduce some of those barriers that are in place. So all of the training requirements, if you have satellite sites, and they recognize that the patient population in Canada is very diverse and spread out. And if we keep everything centralized, we're really limiting the number of patients that could potentially participate in a clinical trial. So they're at a point right now where they're going to be looking into changing the regulations and what that looks like, and they're at a point of listening to the community and stakeholders and patients and investigators about what that would look like and what that would mean. So I think now is a really good time to kind of speak up and step forward about reducing some of these barriers and moving towards these decentralized models.
Mm-hmm. What about you, George? What are your thoughts on regulation and the frameworks that we're going to have to work in to keep these trials going?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna basically confirm what Brianna just said. There's a lot of openness from Health Canada to listen to some of the changes in practice and whatnot. And I think the opportunity that we have as a country is that we're rather a close network of physicians, of researchers, and I think there's an opportunity for us to kind of take a lead in terms of how would the decentralized model actually work out in the country, and just come up with policies that could work. And eventually, it doesn't mean if we need to fine tune them or change them or make them better in the future, so be it. But I think we do have that opportunity as a country to kind of take a lead of really planning out the operational feasibility of some of these decentralized models.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Katie, I don't know if you wanted to add to that at all.
I think the only thing that I would add there would be that I think we need to, again, leverage this opportunity. So not saying that what we've done during COVID is perfect by any means, but I think it's given us a really good starting point. And I think we have to kind of leverage the visibility and leverage the opportunity that we have now, because if not now, when? Because we've made changes over many years, and looking at, for example, things like starting revising our remote consent opportunities and engaging patient partners, we've made great gains. But I think similar to that, when we're looking at regulations and things that have to change, now is the opportunity to take advantage of something that's in front of us and get it while it's in the forefront. And I think there's perhaps more opportunity for good collaboration and more of that burning platform to sort of launch us off and get us moving in the right direction.
So let's turn the discussion now to the thing that made all of this possible, which is technology. We have had some questions about technology and the barriers, and how did you, Brianne in particular, how did you deal with connectivity issues and computer literacy and all of those sorts of things that we're all kind of limping along sometimes every day in our Zoom calls. But just wondering, Brianne, I'm going to start with you.
Sure.
You could talk a little bit about how you address these concerns.
Yeah, so connectivity was really big ones. People started working from home, and in Alberta, there's lots of rural locations. Part of that was kind of bypassing the Wi-Fi, and some of our coordinators had to tap into their hotspots on their phone, tether their phones together. We also had some coordinators that got air cards to be able to do that and plug right into their computers. But in terms of technology as well, we also had to ensure that our teams were mobilized with remote fobs and VPNs to be able to access those electronic medical records. So that was something that we hadn't really considered pre-pandemic. Some of the study teams had done a little bit of work from home, but largely the coordinators were working on site with their Alberta Health Services computers, but they never had to think about that. So we had to really quickly put in place those VPN tokens and trial them out. So that was one piece. And then in terms of computer literacy, most of the programs went virtual, and from a coordinator perspective, there was a large proportion of the coordinators that were extremely experienced. So they had been around for 20 years, but they're used to their paper documents. And it was a really big learning curve. And we had a wonderful project management team that was extremely helpful and accessible. And we had a lot of training sessions, and we did mock throughs of running through a patient from start to finish so that you could see what it was actually going to be like when you had the patient on the phone, and how much time it took to switch from screen to screen, and make sure that your passwords and your websites were all ready to go. But those are really important. You know, not everybody was very unique and different in their experience, but providing those opportunities to be able to trial things out was extremely important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Katie, I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah, you know, it all so rings true, and you know, my heart is in risk management, and it sounds all very formal, but really what it is identifying what you need to make it work, what needs to be successful, and what things can get in the way of that, and walking through. I really like Brianne's concept of walking through that and saying, okay, what happens next? What could go wrong? And not saying, oh, we can't do it because we don't have this, but saying, okay, how do we fix it? What could make it work? And it's more of that positive, creative opportunity mindset. So technology is going to be, like I said, technology can be an enabler or a barrier, and both at the same time. So we have it, and it could be a great enabler to help us with our remote access and connect with people, with our study staff, and with our participants. But if it's not available, or if it doesn't work, that's also a barrier. But even if it does work, then you still have to deal with that privacy and the risk and the perception and the building of trust and the relationship piece that, you know, may be at risk if people don't understand how it works. And I think you really have to walk through. I think that's the best way to do it. And I really like that, Brianne, how you commented on that.
Well, so many hope and aspire to see decentralized trials be a democratizer, right, to help with more diverse and representative patient participation. But if done wrong, as was pointed out by Brianna and Katie, if we're not being thoughtful around access, if we're expecting patients to show up with the proper technology and connectivity in order to participate, we're closing doors rather than opening them. And so we have to expect that many will need technology provision, will need to be trained and be comfortable. And as Katie mentioned, have that trust with the technology that's being used and the systems around them.
Mm-hmm. But you have me wondering now, though, too, were patients ever, so I get this very nice collaborative, you know, kind of setup, helping people through learning the technology, but was there ever an opportunity for patients to actually either feedback or share their thoughts on what the ideal, you know, technology, like what's the ideal framework for a patient to access these remote clinical trials? Has anyone asked?
So I think that for many research sponsors today, the answer is yes. Even prior to the pandemic, one of the most prevailing trends was to include patients when planning and designing research studies, starting in rare and in oncology, but then quickly spread across the entire portfolio. And so I think today, for most research sponsors, this is now a very common part of their process. How they're asking will vary. Are they really getting representative patients, or is Pfizer in New York just getting patients on the corner of 42nd and 2nd in Midtown Manhattan in order to get input? Those are still, I think, open questions. But I think in general, you're certainly seeing a lot that are asking. And now, Lisa, the latest trend is to try to get patient feedback during the trial in terms of experiential through different instruments. Transcelerate had introduced a feedback survey that they helped standardize with a number of sponsors. It's early days still, but I think that the right steps are at least being taken here.
Mm-hmm. And I can second what Craig just said. I mean, the sponsors do want to hear from the patients. We want to make sure that the studies and their experience overall, how it was in the study, so we could even make it better for them in the future. It helps everyone. It improves on the retention of the patients. It improves on the future recruitment of those patients and the overall experience of them. And it's important. We're still kind of stuck between, kind of the privacy laws and what could be collected and what could not be collected from the patients. And I think those are the barriers that we really need to look into and see how we could reduce on some of them and really open up the opportunity for sponsors to learn from the participants and their caregivers. And same thing with the investigational sites.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm just watching some of the questions coming in, and I know that we're almost coming to the end of time. A question about diversity and talking about recruiting patients. Is there a focus on diversity? Brianne, Katie, any thoughts on increasing diversity and inclusion in while you're recruiting?
Yeah, I think diversity is really important, and I think it's about providing options for patients is really what it comes down to, multiple modalities to connect with them. As I'm thinking about these decentralized trials and enrollment of patients and my experience with them too, it's for that trial that I had enrolled for virtually, we really connected with a lot of the families as well, so that we could capture some of those diverse populations and different age groups that maybe weren't familiar with different technology platforms. But as soon as we connected them with somebody else in their family, they were able to tie the whole thing together, and they weren't lost patient populations. I do think that in terms of marginalized populations, some of the technology, I think historically has maybe made it more difficult and created some barriers for enrolling those patients. But I think that the pandemic has really helped us to start looking at ways that we can be as inclusive as possible, so that we're not missing out on different diverse groups.
Right. And how are those groups accessed? Like, are they through patient groups? Are they always through a clinician? Do they ever come to you on their own? How does that work?
So for me, it really depends on the trial, what the trial looks like. But I know that we're kind of pre-planning for another study here. And we started talking about different high-risk populations or marginalized populations. And so we started looking at different advocacy groups that maybe we could reach out and tap to that way, so that we're not just relying on, for example, if it's a general study, like a registry-based thing, consent to contact for the future, that we're not missing those populations that we really want to be able to tap into in the future. So really leveraging those existing stakeholder groups and working with those direct patient groups. I'm speaking in terms of some pediatric work that's going to be coming, and some vulnerable youth populations that it's going to be important for us to work with different high-risk advocacy groups to make sure that we're hearing from them at the patient engagement level before we roll this out, to see how would you like to be contacted and what would be the best method for you. So getting that patient feedback before we get too far down the road, and we want to make sure that we can capture them appropriately.
Yeah, I'm really happy to hear that, because that's actually raising awareness too, because I think that a lot of patients sort of, are dealing with their health issues in a bit of a silo, and they don't really know about trials, and going out to the groups is a great access. Patients. I know, Katie, I saw you nodding.
I'm just on hearing Brianne say things and thinking, yeah, that makes so much sense, because it's all great if we say, yes, we're supporting diversity, but in diversity and recruitment, and we recognize that there are marginalized groups or people that may not have the same access, but offering it or acknowledging it doesn't necessarily make it so. And I think to Brianne's point, it has to be purposeful and it has to be well thought out, and it's not one size fits all. So it can't be just, oh, let's expand and we're acknowledging that we need to be more diverse and more expansive in our recruitment. It has to be purposeful, and it has to be thinking about those specific groups. And, you have to build trust with those groups too, because you can't just sort of offer it and say, well, we offered it, and then that's good enough. So it really does need to be structured and engaged. And it's about that collaboration again, and making sure you have the right people at the table to give fair opinions.
Right. Craig, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think so much comes down to trust, right? I think that decentralized trials can unlock access opportunities. I think that there are patients who have access issues. Clinical trial participation asks a lot. There are people that work shifts that don't live nearby, that can't take time off, that have childcare responsibilities. It asks a lot of people, but decentralized trials alone don't address trust barriers. They don't alone address all the obstacles that exist. It's a tool. It will help. I think that, we can think creatively. For instance, I've seen some that are trying to introduce webinar-like town halls so that patients who may have otherwise felt marginalized can join into sessions that help make sure that they know that they're welcome and that they're a part and a participant in this research together. And so I'm excited to see how a lot of these strategies start to emerge and how decentralized complements so many other important initiatives to improve access.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And George, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, for this from the sponsor side, diversity and inclusion in protocols is one of the probably it's becoming one of the most important points of conducting research. And again, providing that accessibility to everyone that would be representative of a geographical location. And it's important because we want clinical trials to be a clear option for every patient in Canada and in the world, as a matter of fact. So it's very much aligned with what Craig was saying, as well as Katie and Brianne.
So we have 5 minutes left, and so I'm coming to my most favorite question. I want each of you to look ahead. Maybe 1 year, maybe it's 5 years, post-pandemic. What is this all going to look like? Are we going to go back to what we were doing before when it comes to clinical trials? Is it going to be this amazing model of decentralized clinical trials? What are we looking at? I'm going to start with Katie. What do you think? What do you think?
What I think, well, as I've said, I think, looking at what we have accomplished in the last year, in less than ideal circumstances, I think that it's really exciting to look forward and see what we may be able to accomplish in the next 5. I do think I liked Craig's comment about will we reach a tipping point? Is there an ethical imperative to move forward and keep this? I don't think we can go back. I would say that we're already on that path. And I don't think that just because it may or may not suit the sites and the sponsors that we can go backwards at all. I think we have to look towards going forward. I would love to see less of a reliance on bricks and mortar location. I don't think participation should be determined by your geographic location, and I don't know that that's fair for anybody. But we do have some challenges to overcome for sure. But in the next 5 years, I think we're going to see quite an advancement, and I think this was a really good catalyst to get us moving in that right direction.
Craig.
Well, I've shared a couple of thoughts about what this is going to look like in my book, right? We've talked about choice and flexibility for patients. We talked about there being almost this ethical imperative over time. I think we also see this movement around master protocols, and how does decentralized complement some of the master protocol initiatives underway to create more platform studies for a therapeutic area rather than multiple redundant clinical trials competing and bumping into each other in a given therapeutic area. And then finally, this thread around the treating physician, and how will decentralized ultimately start to open up these new opportunities for patients to participate where they receive receive care. We talked earlier about this integration of research in healthcare, enabling research as a care option. This is the way we do it. We can't expect every physician to be an investigator in every trial in order to unlock these opportunities, but decentralized can help us to democratize.
Brianne.
Yeah, I mean, my hope is that we can kind of move towards more of a hybrid model. I think we've set a lot of precedent now about what's possible and what we can continue doing moving forward. But I also think that with this pandemic, we saw how important research and clinical trials are, especially as it relates to treatment options and vaccine. And so we've kind of opened up this door to some other individuals, other physicians that maybe weren't involved in research, to really help them understand why research is important and the way that we can do it safely for patients, and affording patients the opportunity to participate in clinical trial opportunities now, I think is a little more evident, or a lot more evident than it ever was before, because we wouldn't be in the spot we are today with the vaccine rolling out without clinical trials. So my hope is now that we can kind of leverage on the infrastructure we have in place, the precedents that's set from Health Canada and the ethics boards, and kind of what's possible in terms of technology and reaching patients remotely, and reducing some of those barriers to have patients that are in remote sites, allowing them the opportunity to continue participating should they choose to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And George, you get the last word.
Yeah, blue sky thinking. I mean, science and technology is becoming more and more accessible for all of us. And I think within a few years from now, what I would imagine seeing is trials literally being open from coast to coast, and patients are coming from all across Canada. There's no barriers, there's no proximity to a center. It's really a true collaboration and in network of healthcare professionals and stakeholders that are all really rowing in the same direction of providing the research and bringing the research to patients and the participants. And I think that's the day that we could say that every potential participant in Canada would have access to every single studies out there. Mm-hmm. Would be the day that we could actually say, you know what, we've done something really right and really great, and we have truly decentralized and focused it on the participants.
Yeah. I like that. What a great note to end on. And think of all the lives we could save too. It'd be great. It's a
Absolutely.
great model, George.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. This has been a great discussion. I think we are out of time.
So, thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Lisa.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.